African Ascent International invites Professor Noam Chomsky for the second time. Very soon, I'll be honored if I could say he'll be a regular contributor to African Ascent International now that he has been generous with us and decided to join us for the second time.
Very pleased to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. African Ascent International is supported by the Hutchins Center of African and African American Research at Harvard University and also Berklee College of Music. Our viewers, hopefully thousands of you, have witnessed the interview that I did with Professor Noam Chomsky, whom many, quite rightly, without any apology, describe as a genius. I think he is, whatever the term means. And in the first part that I did with him, we covered an expansive territory of his philosophical horizons, embodied in these numerous interviews that he has been giving for the past few years. We focused in particular on the Copernican revolution that he undertook, as I called it there, when we discussed what it is exactly that the physical part of the mind called the brain houses, thereby empowering the speaking subject, the speaking human being. To speak it is as if to be human is to be in language, to be language itself, therefore to think. And in that, the capacity, Professor Noam Chomsky compellingly argued many, many years ago, that empowers the human being to speak is what he called the language faculty, which he appropriately housed in the brain, the physical part of the mind. We're accustomed to think that the mind and the brain are the same. They are not really. The brain is merely the physical part of the mind, but the mind is hard consciousness, the nature of which we still do not know. Today, I'm going to ask my guest to hypothesize with me if he is willing to look at what he might want to call, unless he has already called it that, in his Cartesian projects, in which he discusses the nature of the human, comparing and contrasting us with animals with whom we share family resemblances. For example, the capacity to instinctively feel something or the other is something that we and animals do. Well, the capacity to speak a language, through that empowering a priori power called language, the language faculty itself, is a distinct attribute of the human being. This has been Professor Noam Chomsky's earth-shaking thesis for many, many years, and I have no reason to disagree with him, but humbly learn from him. I think he's essentially right. So today, I'm going to ask him, unless I'm making mistakes, in which case he will correct me. He's so honest. If we could hypothesize and think in terms of maybe another faculty that, for lack of a better term, we might want to call the faculty of the imagination. Please, let's take it from there, Professor Chomsky. Let's start there.
What is the faculty?
The faculty of the imagination.
Imagination?
Imagination, or what you've called, I think, in many, many interviews that you gave, the creative faculty.
Well, if we go
which
back,
is linked to language.
David Hume, he assumed that the faculty of imagination was one aspect of the way the mind functions. And if we look at our faculty of imagination, how does it work? We can imagine visual scenes. We can imagine new ideas. When we use, for carrying out these activities, we use capacities of the organism. For imagining new ideas, we use our language faculty. I don't know of any other way to formulate ideas. In fact, ideas are simply constructions of the language faculty. When I try to decide how to go from, suppose I want to drive somewhere, and I try to think what would be the easiest way to go, I can use a visual image of the area that I will be passing to decide whether to go this way or that way. That's using visual imagination. And we can think of other kinds of imagination, how we would react to other people in some social occasion, let's say. Maybe we can picture the social occasion and meanwhile use our linguistics faculties to think, to create the thoughts that we would be using in those situations. This is just, I don't know if we want to call it a special faculty of the mind. It's the way in which we use the faculties that we have. Whether animals do this or not, we have no idea.
Mm-hmm. You're quite right. And now that you're mentioning animals, in fact, Professor Chomsky, I was going to ask you a charming question, really. Do animals imagine? Does your dog imagine? I know you love your dog. Does he imagine at all, assuming that it's a he, or to use a non-binary language? Does your dog imagine?
The dog that's at my feet right now?
Yes.
Well, I have two dogs. I've observed them very carefully to try to gain some insight into the way they look at the world. And they do, I can plausibly say they have a dozen or so concepts in mind, something like concepts. And they do planning, some limited degree of planning. So to take the most sophisticated case I've seen, one of the dogs happens to be a big one, the other one's a small one. If I'm going to use some, I don't want to use the words directly because they'll listen to me and react. So I'll use some circumlocutions. But if the little one is playing with a toy and the big one wants me to extricate her and play with her outside, she will steal the toy, and then the little one will come to my wife and to me and bark and ask us to do something. So we'll tell the big one to give her back the toy. She'll give her back the toy and run to the door, expecting to be rewarded. Okay, that's a degree of planning. And I suppose you can think of a few simple things like that, but you can enumerate them, and they're essentially, it's a closed system. I don't think anything, I mean, you can add something to it by training or by experience, but very limited. I don't see any indication of any thought beyond a very limited amount. Well, other animals who've been studied, apes have been studied in some detail in the wild, much different than in captivity. And the students of observers of ape communities allege that there's more sophisticated planning and thinking to some extent. But it's very hard to determine. In fact, it's very hard to determine whether another person is thinking. We assume that they are because we assume that they're like us. So when you and I talk, we each assume that the other is like us. And what we would feel or do in a particular situation, we assume the other would do as well. I should say that just this little bit of discussion has agitated my dog to the extent that I will have to try to contain her. Down, Gus. Down. She's listening, and she hears words that signify to her what's in her mind, not in my mind. Down, Gus. Down. Down.
Amazing.
Usually, she just, if we were talking about some other topic, she'd be very quiet, not just lying on the floor sleeping. But she heard enough words to get her moving.
Exactly. I have observed similarly, like you, in one of my philosophy courses at Berklee College of Music. One of my brightest students has a dog. Her name is Bay, who has been attending all the philosophy courses that I teach at Berklee for the past 3-4 years. And each and every time I see Bay, and as you properly pointed out, after a repeated usage of certain kinds of words that must be signalizing something or the other to Bay, Bay begins to participate in her own way, in a live way, in the philosophical ambience in the classroom. It's remarkable. Now, continuing that, yes, please.
That these are, I think it's a little misleading to call these words.
Mm-hmm.
The animal, they're just noises. They don't have the properties of words. We can be fairly confident of that because of the extensive studies that have been made trying huge efforts to try to teach apes anything like words. It's total failure. They can't grasp the concept. Mm-hmm. They can hear noises.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I've also heard you making a very compelling case in one of the interviews that you had when you've been bombarded with this really nonsensical question in the end, namely, do animals think? You took the position that they don't, but from this it doesn't follow that they are not conscious, but they are conscious in a way that human beings do not seem to be. Human beings are conscious because they are language, therefore we assume that they think. Dogs are conscious, you argued, because there are things that your dog could do. This was a humble proposition that I heard from you and I learned from it, that we human beings cannot do. What might that be?
All kinds of things. The dogs make a huge commotion sometime, lots of barking. I have no idea what's going on. I look around, there's nothing I can see, but they're reacting to something in the environment that I'm not perceiving. In fact, not just dogs. I happen to live in the desert. If I go out into the back, there are ants, desert ants, with brains that you can barely see with a microscope. They can carry out cognitive activities that humans can't. They can navigate using the position of the sun in ways that humans can only try to duplicate with complex instruments. That's the way evolution works.
And now, I would like us to backtrack to Hume, whom I know you admire greatly. I share that admiration with you. Hume famously argued that what we call reason is a slave of the passions. I wonder what he meant by that and how that statement could somehow enable us to revisit the way the faculty of the imagination works.
Hume's comment that reason is the slave of the passions. Well, I don't think he meant it literally. He meant that we may think that our ability to reason is independent of our drives, our emotions, our wishes, our conception of the world, our emotional reaction to the world, but it's not true. The way we reason is shaped and formed and influenced heavily by other aspects of our life and actions. We're perfectly aware, we should be aware of this. Can we free the reason to think dispassionately? Well, I'm not David, he's not here, so I can't ask him. But I think that Hume would have agreed that we can. It's an effort. It's an effort to try to think independently of the drives and feelings that consume much of our lives. Not easy. We can see how difficult it is by just observing the way rational people react in radically different ways to the same circumstances, which each will regard the other as totally irrational. Well, that's how, in Hume's terms, reason is becoming the slave of the passions. What you want to believe, what you have strong will to believe, you may believe even if the evidence is against it, because to that extent your reason is not liberated, has not liberated itself from the passions that drive your life. We see that in discussion at the international level, at the personal level, all the time.
And also, Professor Chomsky, I want to explore this thesis with you. This is a question that I've always wanted to ask you, again, within the context of Hume. Namely, would I be correct to assume that reason and passion have two different tasks? They perform differently. I would like to call the task of reason to be the activity of representation. If I want to somehow represent an external object, such as a chair, which is outside of me, without necessarily being Platonic and using the idea of chairness, in which a particular chair might be participating, therefore is this particular chair, as opposed to the other one. But I somehow manage to represent this particular chair to be a chair and not a table in my mind. I would like to reduce this to simply mean that the task of what we call reason is really representation. And as you were contending earlier, for example, from the fact that I and you are speaking, from which I conclude my own way that you must be thinking, I can represent the way you are thinking by radically comparing it with what I do. Since, as Descartes, I think, quite rightly argued, if I have any access at all, it is an access to me, to my brain, in which I may be representing things. But I don't have access to Professor Chomsky's brain. But I can assume from what I look like and what I do that I'm thinking that Professor Chomsky is also thinking. The task of the passions, I think, is different. Challenge me, correct me, please. Namely, passion is motivational. If I see a homeless person on a street and decide to intervene and help in any way I want, it is that suffering of some kind that I have sensed that is motivating me to act and therefore participate in attempting to be attentive, mindful, and generous. Summarizing the propositions then, the task of reason is representational and the task of the passions is motivational. I'm distinguishing representation with motivation. Would I be correct, or have I made some maybe mistakes?
Well, I think every element of what you said is correct as at the level you're describing it, but requires can be susceptible to far deeper analysis. So take a chair. You see a chair, as Wittgenstein pointed out. Suppose the chair starts to talk. Well, you would immediately conclude it's not a chair. It's something that's shaped like a chair, but it's an animate object of some kind. The way you perceive it visually, which of course is a reflection of the structures of your own mind. Another organism wouldn't, like my animals at my feet, would not see it as a chair. They just see it as some thing that they want to get around so as to get to their food, let's say, just not even an independent object. When we see it as a chair, we're interpreting it as something that can be used in a particular way. Something could look physically like a chair and be something totally different. In fact, it could be a table. If someone were to construct a table in the shape of a chair, where we would be eating off the seat, sitting around it in stools, we would say it's a table that looks like a chair. It's not a chair. So what's a chair depends on how we use it, our conception of how it was designed, the purpose for which it was designed, all sorts of things. Actually, Aristotle talked about this. His example wasn't chair. The example he used was house.
Yes.
What's a house? They said in his metaphysics, a house consists of matter and form. The matter of the house is bricks, timbers, things you could touch, things a physicist could find, and so on. The form of the house is the purpose for which it was designed, its intended use, it's the way we integrate it into a broader system. All of that's in our mind, but if it doesn't have that, it's not a house. So something could look exactly like a house, but be a library, could be a stable, could be something invented by a conceptual artist, which is just filling a certain space. It could be a paperweight for a giant, let's say. Whether it's a house or not depends on the way we think about it and conceive of it. And that's true for everything. It's true for chair, for animal, ants. It's true for obvious cases. One case that's obvious is constellations. Take the constellation, the Big Dipper. Well, we see it as a thing, the Big Dipper, but I'm sure my dogs don't. For them, just a lot of lights in the sky. So is it the Big Dipper? Well, if we conceive of it that way, you could say the same about a star. We identify something as a star. It could be just a flux of energy looked at a different way. We construct the world around us. They put this in 17th century terms. The experience conforms to the modes of cognition. We have certain modes of cognition, and what we call experience is what is determined by the way our modes of cognition interact with whatever stimulation happens to reach our sense organs. Now, that's true of even the simplest perception. Mm-hmm. So when I look at you, I see a person, but as Descartes pointed out, I'm constructing the person in my mind. What's reaching my visual system is just scattered points of light. Now we know a lot more about that. Our eyes are constantly in motion, very rapid motion, called saccadic eye motions. and they're just picking up little dots of light here and there. And out of that scattered experience, our minds are constructing a person sitting in front of a computer and so on. In fact, Descartes' analogy is a useful one. He said, thinking of something simple like, say, a triangle. We think we see the triangle. Imagine a blind man with a stick tracing the lines of the triangle with his stick, point after point. Well, that blind man would have the perception of a triangle, but just from successive stimulations in the hand where the stick hit something on the ground. And he argued that's very similar to visual perception. Well, he couldn't have shown it at the time, but now we know that it's true. Our perception of a triangle is not just, here's this unitary object floating through the air and coming into our mind. It's the result of eye movements, which are carried out, of course, subconsciously and inaccessible to consciousness, a series of stimulations, kind of like the blind man with a stick, except that it's almost instantaneous. And Descartes carried it further. He said, imagine an infant who has had no experience of geometrical objects. And suppose the infant is presented with something that I draw on paper, intending to be a triangle. He said, he guessed, and he turns out to be correct, that when the infant first sees this figure, it will see a distorted triangle, not the exact figure that it is, which will be lines that aren't quite straight and they don't quite meet at a point because there's a gap. But the infant will just take that to be distortion of a perfect geometrical triangle. Well, very recent work, some of it recently just published. Stan Dehaene, a neuroscientist in Paris, has just been doing work on recognition of geometrical figures. And it turns out we have an internal geometry which constructs perfect figures and uses them as a kind of a template for perceiving things in the outside world, something like a grammar, but one of visual geometrical figures. So Descartes' speculation was pretty much correct. And in general, the idea that experience conforms to the modes of our internal cognitive processes, that seems to be a very general and very significant truth. So going back just to the simplest part of what you were talking about, seeing the chair, even that has plenty of complexities. Mm-hmm. And every other part of what you discussed can also be taken apart, looked at, can try to determine what's involved in it. Take the homeless man. When we see a man who we say is a homeless man, we're using a very rich conceptual framework. Mm-hmm. of what does homeless mean. It's not so simple. I mean, maybe somebody offered him an apartment and he doesn't want to take it because his personal dignity would be offended if he would take that gift. Is he homeless? Well, in a certain sense, he's homeless. In another sense, he isn't. These are not trivial concepts. Anything we begin to think about, as soon as we think about it, it moves in very complex directions. In fact, that was the great discovery of the scientific revolution of the 17th century. You go back to neo-scholastic science, it pretty much had answers to everything. If you see a triangle, it's because the form of the triangle moves through the air and implants itself in your brain. If a ball falls to the ground, it's because it's moving to its natural place. It was an answer to everything. Galileo and his contemporaries, their great achievement was to be puzzled about these apparent truisms, to say, why does the ball fall to the ground, not rise to the sky? Why does a ball dropped from the top of the mast of a moving sailboat, why does it fall to the base of the mast, not behind? Actually, it was assumed at the time it would fall behind. Galileo had to do impressive thought experiments to show the opposite. Real experiments would never have worked. They would have just led to chaos. But the same with, it was assumed at the time that if you have a heavy ball, a big ball of lead and a small ball of lead, the big one will fall faster. Galileo showed that they fall at the same rate. And he showed it only by thought experiments. Real experiments would have been chaotic. He didn't drop balls off the top of the Tower of Pisa. Did elegant thought experiments. That's how modern science began, by being puzzled about simple phenomena and trying to find answers instead of just using what 17th century scientists called occult ideas. Mm-hmm. Just things fall to their natural place. Things attract each other by sympathies. Those were occult ideas. And in fact, when we talk about something being a chair, we're not asking simple questions that we should be puzzled about. What makes it a chair? And that's where science begins. It's where serious inquiry begins. Of course, we don't do this in every aspect of our lives. A kid never walk across a room. But if we want to think seriously about the nature of things, we quickly move into such questions. That's traditional philosophy turning into modern science.
Indeed. In fact, Professor Chomsky, I'm really humbled by this remarkably original way in which you used your understanding of enlightenment, which you sharply distinguished from the Kantian one. Not that you disagreed with Kant, you agree with them that enlightenment is nothing more than the courage to think for yourself. But as you just did, you added, enlightenment is also the capacity to exercise the possibility of being puzzled by becoming puzzled. And how you did it in a loving way when you enabled me to be puzzled by what I thought was conventionally the case, namely that I could use concepts such as homelessness and chair without getting challenged. You challenged me by really opening up the use of the capacity to be puzzled, and first ask the question, well, Teodros, what do you mean by homelessness? Because I assumed that it had a singular meaning, very much like, what did you mean by chair? Again, I assumed that there is a particular meaning of chairness, the Platonic one. You have the idea of chairness, and then you look at a particular chair and you say that particular chair is a chair by virtue of the fact that it's participating in the idea of chairness. I'm humbled by the way you challenged me. Now, I share a passion with you, this passion and respect that you have for Aristotle and Wittgenstein. And so I want to take you in that direction, if I may, by over-exploiting your mind. But it is an inexhaustible mind that you have from Professor Chomsky, so I'll ask the question. About 2,500 years ago, as you properly argued, Aristotle had already made a fantastic distinction between possessing something and using it, which I believe, with modifications, is exactly what Wittgenstein did when he distinguished the picture theory of language and the use function of language. I would like us to spend some time to talk about these concepts for the benefit of the philosophical community and, much more importantly, ordinary human beings who want to be puzzled.
Well, we can go back to our friend Aristotle, who made a distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. Crucial distinction. Strikingly, this distinction was not really understood until the mid-20th century. So if you look at the rich discussions of language over millennia, they were always talking about use of language, not possession of language. That's a distinction which they were unable to formulate. So when, say, Wilhelm von Humboldt, this major thinker, major linguist, philosopher, humanist, when he was struck by the fact that, in his words, language involves infinite use of finite means. He wondered how that could be. We're finite creatures, but we can make unlimited use of language. We can also always make up some idea more complex and more intricate than any that's been developed so far. Our normal conversation constantly uses new expressions that have never been used before. Like, take what we were just discussing. Could turn out that in the entire history of the human species, no one has ever asked whether a chair could be a table. Maybe we're the first ones in history ever to have said that. But we can certainly do it, and we understand each other. That goes on all the time. But notice that he was talking about infinite use of finite means. What about infinite possession of finite means? Now we understand that concept. He didn't. And we understand it because of discoveries of great mathematicians in the 20th century. Alan Turing, Kurt Gödel, Emil Post, and others developed the modern theory of computation. And the modern theory of computation allows us to sharply distinguish between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. So we have in our minds a linguistic capacity that generates, constructs infinitely many thoughts. Then comes the question of, how do we access those thoughts? How do we use them? That's a different question. There are many thoughts we have in our mind that we can't use because we don't have, say, the memory capacity to allow us to use them. You can easily demonstrate this. There's plenty of work about it. We have thoughts in our mind that we're incapable of accessing. I'll give you a simple example. 60 years ago, take the sentence, John had a book stolen. There are three different interpretations of that, three different meanings. Almost nobody can find them, even trained linguists, sophisticated trained linguists find it difficult or impossible to find more than two of the three meanings. However, if you construct circumstances in which they're used, they can quickly see them. I mean, just leave it as a problem to think about. People have tried hard. It's very hard, but they're there. And if you get the right circumstances, you see them instantly. Well, those are thoughts that are generated by our mind, but for one reason or another, we just don't have access to. There's a very sharp distinction between, take even a simpler case. arithmetic. We have in our minds basic arithmetic, how to add two numbers and get a third number. But if you try to add big numbers in your head, you're not going to get the right answer because your memory capacity isn't sufficient. Other capacities aren't sufficient. You need external aids like paper and pencil and time in order to get the answer that's in your head. Your use of arithmetic, your possession of arithmetic are quite different things. And it's not just us. It's also true of your laptop computer. Your laptop computer you can put in a program which will generate arithmetic, addition, multiplication, division, and so on, a calculator. But the actual computer, the thing that's on your desk, can only do that up to a point. And for one thing, it doesn't have enough memory. You want to keep it going indefinitely, infinite use of finite means, you have to add more memory to it. It keeps the same rule structure, doesn't change the rules, but it has more memory to work with. There'll also just be random errors because of the way physical objects work. We know that, unfortunately, with our own use of computers, random errors come along and may cause problems. Well, that's a difference between the program that's in the computer, which is perfect and generates all of arithmetic, and the use of it, which involves other aspects of the computer, like its memory limitations, its physical imperfections, and so on. That's the difference between possession and use of language. Now, Humboldt's infinite use of finite means is two different conceptions. One is the infinite possession by finite means. Second is our infinite unbounded use of what we possess, which is quite different. And when you look at them closely, they separate in radically different ways. Well, that's a modern, literally 2,500 years of study of language never made Aristotle's distinction. I can't find anyone in history after Aristotle who used it until the 20th century clarification that was given by the theory of computation that developed in modern mathematics and is the basis for much of our contemporary scientific civilization. A lot of it's based on computation. But that's basically a 20th century discovery. Bits and pieces were known, but the true clarification, the development of a fundamental notion of computation, that's a mid-20th century discovery by several different leading mathematicians almost simultaneously. So Turing did it in one way, Alonzo Church did it in a different way, Emil Post did it in a third way. They all converge to the same absolute notion of computation. It's a major discovery of mathematics. And it clarifies lots of things for us, like Aristotle's distinction between possession and use of knowledge, which was a very murky mixture of confused ideas for a long time, 2,500 years.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Chomsky. What did Wittgenstein add to these radical distinctions between possession of something and using it? Is this also what Wittgenstein was trying to distinguish between the Tractatus and the philosophical investigations? Or, to ask it differently, it is the case with Wittgenstein that he was distinguishing what he called competence from performance. that we don't really become competent at anything until after we can actually perform it, or that we can perform it only because we have the capacity to competently do it. A distinction of that kind, but feel free to break it apart.
Well, it's very difficult to talk about Wittgenstein, especially the late Wittgenstein, because his writing, well, very insightful and perceptive, is aphoristic, purposely. So there's, well, something happened outside. I can't tell, but they can. I mean, it takes, say, any of Wittgenstein's ideas. Take his idea that you can't have a private language. Suppose that you and I want to discuss that. First thing we have to do is figure out what on earth did Wittgenstein mean by private language.
Right.
Okay, here's an exercise you can carry out. Take the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Fine work, excellent articles on many different aspects of philosophy. So take the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look up Wittgenstein's private language argument. Well, what you will find is lengthy discussion of what Wittgenstein meant. There's very little presentation of the argument because nobody knows exactly what he meant.
Exactly.
And in fact, you find many different philosophers cited trying to figure out what is the private language argument. Well, that's the problem in talking about Wittgenstein. So did he distinguish possession and use? It's very hard to give an answer. We could interpret the Tractatus as something like possession.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Formal system which represents the world. But is that what he meant? We don't know. Does the later Wittgenstein, he does talk about, he doesn't really say that meaning is use. He says if you want to find out the meaning, look at the use. That's a way towards finding out the meaning. But it never says that that is the meaning. So what we were talking about before, let's say the meaning of the word chair.
Yes.
I don't know what he would say. He does give the example that I quoted, that if a chair started to talk, you wouldn't think of it as a chair. But where his thinking goes from there, we can only guess. Because he didn't tell us, and he didn't want us to know. He didn't think you could know. He seems to have thought there's no clear answers to those questions.
So it's as if we can apply that last statement in the Tractatus. If you can't name something, you're better off to shut up. Maybe the same principle could be applied, Professor Chomsky, to the attempt at singularly describing what a private language is. You can present it for discussion, but not with the conviction that you know it so well that you can distinguish it from other representations of it, which are unlike the one that you think is particularly the case. Something to that effect, but I'm not sure. I'm on a very shaky ground here.
Well, as I said, Wittgenstein's writing inspires lots of thinking, inspires different ways of thinking, different from his. So that famous last sentence of the Tractatus that you quoted, that if we cannot talk about something, we should remain silent. I think we can take that apart and develop different ways of interpreting it, which can be useful. Yes. So I think we can make a distinction between what I've called problems and mysteries. Yes. Problems are things, are questions that are within the range of our understanding. We may not understand them, but they're at least within the range of our understanding. We might be able sometime to understand them. There are other things that are probably outside the range of our understanding. We're just not designed to understand them. So take some other organ. We can see it clearly in the case of other organisms. So take, I don't want to talk about them because they'll react. So let's take a rat, something my animals don't know about. Take a rat. You can train a rat to run a maze. You can train it to turn left and then at the next break turn right, a left-right maze. You can train it to that. You can't, that's a problem for a rat. It can solve it. You cannot train a rat to run a prime number maze, to turn left at every prime number of turns. It's not within its capacity. It's a mystery for rats. So there are problems for rats. There are mysteries for rats. And what's a problem for one animal might be a mystery for another. Like for the ants in my backyard, finding their way back to the nest using the position of the sun in the sky, that's a problem. They can solve it. In fact, they solve it all the time. For me, it's a mystery. I can't solve it. The only way I can solve it is by constructing complex instruments, which will then enable me to duplicate what this animal with a minuscule brain does instinctively. So that's a mystery for me. I can get around it with high-tech instruments, but I can't do it in my mind. And are there mysteries for humans? Well, the near universal consensus among philosophers and scientists is that there aren't any mysteries for humans. There is David Hilbert, famous mathematician, put on had his gravestone have what he thought was the most important statement that he could think of. There is no ignoramus. There is nothing that we can't learn. We're universal. We have a universal intelligence. Maybe. I don't see why we should accept that view. I think there probably are mysteries for us. And I think we can even guess what some of them are. Can't prove it, but can guess it. Take, say, the question of freedom of will. The greatest thinkers have been discussing that for thousands of years. We're no closer to an answer. We have the following circumstance. Every one of us, you, me, philosophers who deny it, every one of us acts as if we have freedom of will, meaning we basically believe it. We all believe that I could lift my finger if I want, or I could put it down if I want. You look at the philosophers and scientists, they all deny it. Say there isn't any freedom of will, it's an illusion, and so on. None of them believe it, as we can see from their actions. In fact, they wouldn't even be saying it if they believed it. Because if they felt that all their actions were determined, that statement that we have no freedom of will, everything's determined, would be as much reason to say that as glub, 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 it's determined. It's like a thermostat, just a noise coming out. And nobody thinks that. Well, does science tell us anything about it? Not really. Science just tells us can't handle it. Science tells us we can deal with determinacy, we can deal with randomness, but if something's not deterministic and not random, we can't deal with it. Well, two options. We can say it doesn't exist because science can't deal with it, even though we all think it exists. Or we can say there's a mystery for humans. We're like rats. They can't solve prime number mazes. We can't solve the problem of freedom of will. There's no clear answer to that question. Maybe some different kind of intelligence, different from ours, could look at us the way we look at rats and explain why it's a mystery for us. Or maybe not. Maybe it really doesn't exist. we're at a position we just can't answer.
Well,
And I think there are other things like that.
you have originally argued in a startling way as the philosopher of the language faculty that you could describe for us, as you have for years, how language functions, such as we can generate meanings which, Quine argued, have indeterminate status in the end. But that is not equivalent to know the origin of language. You have argued that the origin of language is perhaps mystical as consciousness itself.
Well, I think there we have a mixture of problems and mysteries. Take the origin of language or the origin of cognition. In principle, there would be ways to learn about that. Mm-hmm. If we could project ourselves back 200,000 years when modern humans emerged in the evolutionary record, and we could observe what was happening, we could probably find out a lot about the origin of language. So that's, in principle, a problem, but we just can't do it. There's no way. It's impossible, physically impossible. It's not physically possible. You know, you could debate about time travel and relativity theory and so on, but basically within the means that we know of, there's no way to find the answer. So that's not technically a mystery, but it's something that we can't answer because of limitations. It's like saying, I can't multiply two big numbers in my head because I don't have enough memory.
I see.
If I had paper and pencil, I could do it. Okay, so it's in my mind, can generate it. Can't do it because I don't have the means. And things like many questions about the origin of language are like that. There's an excellent article on this if you want to look into it.
Please.
By Richard Lewontin, a great evolutionary biologist at Harvard who died a few years ago. There's a 4-volume study called Invitation to Cognitive Science. And in the 4th volume, he has an article on evolution of cognition. And his basic conclusion, which he puts at the end, is tough luck. It's his words. He said, you'd like to be able to answer the questions. There's just no known way of doing it. None of the means known in evolutionary biology will get you answers to these questions. Now, he didn't use the problem mystery distinction, but I would rephrase it. I would say this is a problem, not a mystery, but we can't solve the problem because we don't have the means to do it. That's, we therefore have to find other means. There are lots of things like that, but that's different than true mysteries, which are beyond our capacity. And there it's a contentious area. I don't think you won't find many people who believe that there are mysteries for humans. I'm probably one of the few, but I think there's no reason for us to believe that we're outside of the organic world. If we're organic creatures, we'll be like other creatures. Their capacities have a scope and they have limits. That's true of every physical capacity. It's true of every cognitive capacity of every other organism. I don't see why we should escape it. And in fact, I think there are even more or less logical grounds for thinking we don't escape it. It's inherent, intrinsic to the very notion of scope and limits. If your capacities have scope, it's because of internal structure. So we can become an embryo, can become a human, not a bird, because of some intrinsic structure that gives it a capacity to become a bird or a human, but it also it imposes limits. The very internal structure that enables us to become a human prevents us from becoming a bird. No different kind of nutrition to the embryo that can turn a human embryo into a bird. And I think that logic holds for cognitive capacities too. We can develop languages. An infant reflexively acquires a language with virtually no experience. By now, there's extensive experimental evidence showing that. In fact, an infant can acquire many languages simultaneously, 5 or 6 languages reflexively, not even knowing they're different languages, very quickly with almost no evidence. But that's because of built-in intrinsic capacities. And it means there are other systems which in fact we can construct, which the infant couldn't acquire. There's a logical relation between scope and limits. And my feeling is that should lead us to anticipate that we are like other organisms, and that our cognitive capacities, our emotional capacities, and so on, probably have limits we can't transcend, though in principle they could be transcended. Well, I'm afraid I've transcended my time.
In fact, I was going to end it with 2 appeals that I would like to make to you, Professor Chomsky. First, my sincerest felt thanks for you, considering how busy you are, to have given me 1 hour of your precious time. I suggest for future appearance, if you're available, I would like us to focus on examining the problem of consciousness in relationship to language, so that we can discuss the question of mystery, I think.
A lot to say about that.
Yes. So I would like us to have an episode on that when you are available.
Right now. Good to talk to you again.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for African Ascent International.